It's been said that influence is the union of power and purpose. Judge Robert H. Bork embodies both.
Bob is a brilliant man himself, but beyond that, he's a man of principle. He understands the Constitution, he understands what the founders had in mind, and he stands up for those principles.
He also has come to symbolize to a lot of people someone who will stand outside the mainstream and tell the mainstream to shape up and come on over. And indeed, there are Borkians. He's become a school of thought, and that is a tremendous tribute.
Born into a modest Pittsburgh household in 1927, Bork was groomed to be an independent thinker by his mother, who passed on her keen intellectual curiosity. Even as a boy, Bork enjoyed standing outside the mainstream. While other kids practiced their curveball, Bork studied socialism. Still, he was one of the boys, editor of the school paper, and a champion boxer.
He's a pugilist in pretty much everything he does. I think my father was a boxer before he learned about boxing, and I think he's been a boxer ever since, even after retiring from the ring.
After hanging up his boxing gloves, Bork decided to serve his country. He joined the Marines, but only after convincing a very tough opponent, his mother. Then in 1947, he landed at the University of Chicago.
He's always been someone who wants to explore ideas and search for truth. I think is where he learned what he wanted to do, which was to wreak himself upon the world, to be involved in ideas, and that's really what it's all about for him.
After graduation, Bork planned to attend Columbia School of Journalism and become a writer. When Columbia didn't recognize his undergraduate degree, he turned instead to the University of Chicago Law School, where mentors Ed Levy and Aaron Director helped to further shape his ideas about the world. By 1956, Bork had married his college sweetheart, Claire Davidson, and was a successful antitrust specialist in Chicago. But by the early 60s, the humdrum life at a law firm had lost its spark. The fighter, the explorer, was unfulfilled. So when Yale offered him a position as an assistant professor in 1962, he loaded the family in the Chevy and headed to New Haven. At Yale, Bork was a respected professor of antitrust law. He later branched into an area of study that would become his trademark, constitutional law. Inspired by fellow professor Alex Bickel, Bork's theories ultimately set the stage for debate on judicial philosophy and constitutional interpretation.
Judge Bork was the first major scholar to endorse originalism and judicial restraint, and to do it with great force and great effectiveness.
He has been the one who has said, judges, if they aren't tied to the Constitution, they're not tied to anything. It sounds like a fairly straightforward point, but the fact of the matter is, Judge Bork has been the one to bring that front and center.
There's no one who has articulated the conservative point of view on the Constitution more or better than Judge Bork.
In 1972, a Bork article for the New Republic entitled "Why I Am for Nixon" caught the eye of the administration, and soon he had a new job, U.S. Solicitor General. But any excitement over his new position was short-lived. 4 months later, amid the rising Watergate scandal, he was immersed in what would become known as the infamous Saturday Night Massacre. When Nixon demanded the dismissal of Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox, both the Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General resigned rather than comply. New hire Bork was next in line, with no one below in the chain of command. Believing Nixon had the legal authority to fire Cox, Bork handed out the pink slip.
People had so much respect for his integrity. They know he had done what the president had the power to order to be done, and yet he had the integrity to stand up to the White House and to insist that the Watergate Special Prosecutor's Office be held together.
Bork was instrumental in finding a replacement for Cox, Leon Jaworski. Having calmed the storm, he stayed with the Justice Department through the end of the Ford administration. His sense of humor no worse for the wear.
He was always going off to give a speech someplace or another. And he had a standard line, which was that during the turbulent period of the 1960s, when the University of California at Berkeley was sending the radicals down the Ho Chi Minh Trail to the colleges of the East, he thought the greatest hope for higher education in America was the San Andreas Fault.
When President Carter took office, Bork returned to Yale, where he finished his first book, The Antitrust Paradox, A Policy at War with Itself, which revolutionized the field.
I couldn't understand my antitrust course when I took it at Harvard. It didn't seem to me to make sense, and it was only after I read Bob's book that I realized I was right. He really did bring keen intellectual insight into that field.
After his wife Claire passed of cancer in late 1980, Bork returned to D.C., this time in private practice. But no sooner had he moved into his new law office than President Ronald Reagan appointed him to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. While his reputation as a tough lawyer preceded him, any preconceived notions that Judge Robert Bork was straight-laced and predictable were soon put to rest.
Everyone who knows him notes his sense of humor. He is absolutely hilarious. And here's one of the acid tests. Those who worked with him adored him.
He was incredibly open-minded. People have this impression of him as having strong views, and on certain issues he certainly did. But I remember there were many times when he would be willing to reconsider even an opinion that he had issued.
By the mid-'80s, Judge Bork's outspoken opinions on judicial restraint and original intent put him at the top of the list for a Reagan Supreme Court nomination. So it was no surprise that when Justice Lewis Powell stepped down from the bench in June of 1987, Reagan called on his judicial heavyweight, Judge Robert Bork. The timing was significant.
The Democrats had just taken control of the Senate. Secondly, you had a lot of left-wing groups that were very much energized because of the critical position of Justice Powell's vacancy there in terms of the makeup of the court between those who were judicial activists and those who were faithful to the Constitution.
Conservatives in one corner, liberals in the other. When the bell sounded, the country was in for the Supreme Court bout of the century.
These left-wing groups, aided and abetted by some of the leftist senators, turned it from a confirmation process really into a political extravaganza.
His confirmation was a great education if people were listening to what he was saying, but it's also great education in how vicious and underhanded politics can be.
After weeks of testimony and hearings, the opposition had accomplished what it set out to do. But Bork was not about to throw in the towel without one final round.
The question was whether his name should be withdrawn or whether he should proceed and challenge the Senate to a vote. And Judge Bork very heroically, in my opinion, very courageously said, we ought to put it to a vote and make the Senate account for itself on this particular issue.
As expected, the vote went against Bork's confirmation, but a critical democratic principle had been upheld. Bork's wife, Mary Ellen, was inspired by his courage.
When it was over with, we both said, we were probably much stronger persons for having gone through it. And it made you realize that some things really are worth fighting about.
It would have been much better to have had Bob on the Supreme Court these last 20 years, but the presentation Bob made, the gallant presentation, against the flaccid mainstream consensus of the time, simply broadened what is discussable, and that is a public service beyond price.
The following year, Judge Bork hung up his D.C. Circuit robe, but continued his service to the country in other ways. He served as a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research and is a fellow at the Hudson Institute. Currently, he is also a professor at Ave Maria School of Law and, of course, a long-standing co-chairman of the Board of Visitors of the Federalist Society, which he helped get off the ground.
Judge Bork gave the keynote speech at our very first conference in April of 1982, and he really gave us a vital, push in getting the organization started.
Since leaving the bench, Bork has penned critical books exposing trends in the court system and American society. Coercing Virtue, which takes on international law and its effect on American sovereignty, and 2 bestsellers, The Tempting of America, which further defines his groundbreaking opinions on judicial philosophy and original intent, and Slouching Towards Gomorrah, which underscores decline in our society, the inspiration for which had rather dubious beginnings.
We were watching the Super Bowl, in which the halftime entertainment, which is always a schlock, kitsch, and disgusting, was Michael Jackson. And it was when Michael Jackson made an obscene gesture. I think he grabbed his crotch. And Bob was there, and I think he physically recoiled, and that recoil carried him all the way through a book manuscript.
A brilliant author, renowned legal scholar, esteemed judge, Robert Bork has put his larger-than-life stamp on American culture. As such, he's captured the attention of a nation. He's been spoofed by such heavy hitters as The Simpsons and Star Trek, is the inspiration for comic book heroes and villains. But perhaps his deepest foray into pop culture is found in the dictionary. Bork, verb, obstruct someone, especially a candidate for public office, through systematic defamation or vilification.
Well, Dad likes to say that the having your last name as a verb is a form of immortality. I think it's funny and a conversation starter, but I think what it really means is that you stood up for what you believed in, and you don't kowtow to anybody. And if they want to take their best shot at you and work you over, well, that's their business, but you're true to yourself. And I think he's been that way, and he's taught us that too.
Staying true to his values, Bork made a very important decision in 2003 to join the Catholic Church.
When we told people about this, a friend of ours said, well, now Mary Ellen can give St. Monica and St. Jude a rest. St. Monica being the mother of St. Augustine, who prayed for his conversion for many years, and St. Jude being the patron saint of the impossible cases.
A fighter, an explorer, a man of principle. Judge Robert H. Bork is one of the greatest conservative legal thinkers of our time. Currently at work on his latest book, he continues to challenge, continues to explore, and continues to search for the truth.